The alarm cut through the cafeteria before I even had time to sit down. Red light. 3 short bursts. Then a voice on the ceiling speakers, calm but firm, telling every station crew member to remain in place and every visiting delegate to stay seated until further notice. My tray was still in my hands, 1 slice of pizza balanced on top of a pile of fries, and my heart was already beating faster than it should for a lunch break. Something was wrong. Something was wrong on day 1 of the biggest diplomatic event this station had ever hosted. The Ithran delegation had arrived only 6 hours earlier. 5 ships, silent and slow, sliding into the docking bays like they were afraid to touch anything. Their leaders had come to decide something that mattered more than most of us wanted to admit. Earth wanted a trade agreement. The Ithran wanted proof that humans could be trusted with something bigger than trade. Proof that we were not dangerous. Proof that we could sit across a table from another species and not ruin everything within a day. We had less than a day left to prove it, and the alarm had just gone off. I found a seat near the window, tray still shaking slightly in my hands, and looked around. Every human in the cafeteria had gone still, every Ithran too. Their skin, usually a soft violet gray, had turned a shade darker, almost storm-colored, which I had learned during the mandatory briefing meant alertness bordering on fear. A woman named Grace, one of our security officers, jogged past the tables with her hand near her earpiece, listening to something the rest of us could not hear. I caught her eye for half a second. "What happened?" I asked. "Not now," she said, and kept moving. Not exactly comforting. Beside me, an Ithran student named Zylara sat frozen, her tray untouched, her long fingers pressed flat against the table like she was trying to steady herself against something invisible. I had met her 3 days earlier during the welcome tour, when I made the mistake of explaining that our food came in more than 700 separate categories, and she asked me, with complete seriousness, how any species survived that kind of chaos. Now she looked less curious and more afraid. "Do you know what is happening?" she asked, her voice carrying that strange double tone their translators never fully smoothed out. "No idea," I said, "but it sounds serious." Another voice came through the speakers, this time sharper, more urgent. "A quarantine breach detected near Docking Bay 4. All personnel to remain calm. Security teams responding." Docking Bay 4. That was where the Ithran lead ship had come in. The room went from tense to something close to panic in under 10 seconds. A few of the delegates at the far table stood up, their guards rising with them, hands moving toward weapons they were technically not supposed to have on board but clearly did anyway. Our own security team, led by a tall officer named Ethan, moved to block the exits, not to trap anyone, but to keep the situation from turning into chaos before anyone understood what was actually happening. "Everyone stay seated," Ethan called out, his voice steady even though his eyes were not. "This is a precaution. We do not yet know the source of the alert." Zylara leaned toward me, her voice lower now. "If this becomes a weapon, my people will leave. If they leave angry, there will be no agreement. There may be worse than no agreement." I did not fully understand what she meant by worse, but the way her ridges pulled tight above her eyes told me enough. Worse meant conflict. Now, worse meant the kind of history human beings had lived through more than once, the kind where 2 sides stopped talking and started preparing instead. A second alarm joined the first, this one lower, more mechanical, and I felt the floor vibrate slightly under my feet. Somewhere below us, heavy doors were sealing shut. The cafeteria windows, usually open to the stars, now had steel shutters sliding down from above, cutting off the view piece by piece, until only a narrow strip of black space remained. "They are locking down the station," Zylara said. "That is standard procedure for a quarantine alert," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "It does not mean anything bad happened. It means they are being careful." "Your version of careful looks very similar to my version of preparing for war." I did not have an answer for that. Minutes passed, long, heavy minutes where nobody spoke above a whisper, and every sound from the corridor outside made every head turn at once. A group of Ithran guards near the far wall kept their hands close to their belts, watching our security team with an intensity that made the air feel thinner than it should have. Then Ethan's earpiece crackled again, and this time I saw his shoulders drop just slightly, the tension draining from his posture in a way that gave me a small flicker of hope. "Stand down," he said into his radio. Then louder, to the room. "The alert has been reclassified. It was a false trigger. Repeat, false trigger. No breach occurred." A ripple of relief moved through the humans in the room, quiet sighs and shifting shoulders, the kind of release that comes after holding your breath without realizing it. But the Ithran delegation did not relax the same way. If anything, their guards straightened further, their expressions darkening instead of easing. An older Ithran man stood from the delegation table, tall even by their standards, his robes a deep blue that marked him, I would learn later, as one of their senior negotiators. His name was Kalor, and his voice carried across the cafeteria with the kind of weight that made even our security team go quiet. "A false alarm," he said, each word measured, careful, cold. "On the day we arrived to discuss trust. Your systems detected a breach that did not exist, locked an entire station around my people, and you expect us to call this an accident." "It happens," Ethan said carefully. "Sensor faults occur even in the most advanced systems. This was a technical failure, not an act of aggression." "A technical failure," Kalor repeated, and something in his tone made it clear he did not believe that explanation, or did not want to. "Perhaps this is a demonstration. A way to show us how quickly you can seal every exit, lock every door, and leave my people with no way to defend themselves if you decided the moment required it." The room went silent in a way that felt dangerous. I looked at Zilara, and her face had gone pale, the violet tone almost gray now, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "He is going to end the negotiations," she whispered, "right now, in this room." "He can't," I said, "not over a false alarm." "You do not understand how fragile this was to begin with," she said. "My people have been hurt before by promises that turned into locked doors. This is exactly the kind of moment that convinces them they were right to be afraid." Kalor was still speaking, his voice rising slightly now, addressing not just Ethan but the entire room, human and Ithran alike. He spoke of old wounds, of other worlds that had once offered peace and delivered something else entirely, of the danger in trusting a species that could seal an entire station shut in under a minute without warning. I felt something twist in my chest, not fear exactly, but a kind of desperate frustration. Everyone in that cafeteria had spent days preparing speeches, agreements, trade proposals, careful diplomatic language meant to build trust one sentence at a time, and all of it was about to collapse because of a sensor glitch and an old wound none of us had caused. I looked down at my tray. The pizza slice was still there, slightly cooler now, cheese starting to firm up at the edges. It seemed like the smallest, most useless thing in the world at that moment. But Zilara was still staring at it, not at Kalor, not at the guards near the wall, at the pizza. I remembered the way her face had changed the first time she tried it, days ago, before any of this began. The way the tension in her shoulders had disappeared for just a moment, replaced by something unguarded and completely honest. I remembered thinking that whatever that reaction was, it was not something you could fake. An idea formed, small and maybe foolish, but it was the only thing I had. I stood up. Grace turned toward me immediately, one hand lifting slightly, a silent warning to stay seated. Ethan's eyes found me too, sharp and questioning. Even Kalor paused mid-sentence, his gaze shifting toward the human who had just interrupted a moment that was supposed to be reserved for leaders and diplomats, not a station worker holding a lunch tray. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaking slightly despite my best effort to sound calm. "I'm not a negotiator. I don't have the right words for this, but I want to say something, if that's allowed." Kalor studied me for a long moment. I expected him to wave me away, to tell me this was not the place for a low-ranking human to speak. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, the Ithran equivalent, I would later learn, of curiosity, overtaking anger for just a moment. "Speak," he said. I swallowed hard. "You said this looked like a demonstration," I said. "A way to show how fast we could shut everything down. Maybe that's what it looked like, but I don't think that's what happened. I think a machine made a mistake, the same way machines sometimes do, and everyone in this room, human and Ithran, got scared at the same time for the same reason, not because either side wanted a fight, because both sides are still learning how to trust something new." Kalor did not respond immediately. I kept going, because stopping now felt more dangerous than continuing. "3 days ago, I gave someone from your delegation a piece of food I didn't think twice about," I said, glancing at Zilara, who was watching me with wide eyes now, ridges lifted high. "It wasn't a plan, it wasn't a strategy, I had extra." She looked interested, and I offered it, because that's what people do when they have more than they need, and someone nearby wants some. That's it. That's the whole reason. I picked up the tray and walked slowly toward the delegation table, aware of every eye in the room following me, aware that Grace had shifted her stance, ready to step in if anything went wrong, aware that my hands were shaking harder now than they had during the alarm itself. I stopped in front of Kalor. "I can't fix what your people have been through," I said. I can't undo whatever happened before that made a locked door feel like a threat instead of an accident, but I can offer you the same thing I offered her 3 days ago, because it's the only honest thing I know how to do right now. I held out the tray. Want some pizza? For a long moment, nothing happened. The cafeteria stayed completely silent, the kind of silence that feels heavier than sound, where you can hear your own pulse in your ears. Kaylor looked down at the slice, then back up at me, his expression unreadable behind centuries of diplomatic training I could not begin to guess at. Then Zylara spoke, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry across the room. "Elder Kaylor," she said. "I tried this 3 days ago. I did not report it in my official notes because I did not think it mattered. I was wrong." Kaylor turned toward her, and something passed between them. A silent exchange that felt older than the argument happening in this room, older than the treaty itself. "Explain," he said. "When I tasted it," Zylara said, standing now, her voice steadier with each word, "I felt something I have not felt since I left home. Not fear, not caution. Something simple and warm, the kind of feeling our elders always said belonged only to family, to trusted friends, to safety earned over many seasons together. I felt it from a stranger, offered without calculation, within the first days of meeting him." She looked at me, then back at Kaylor. "I do not believe a species capable of causing harm without hesitation would also be capable of an act this small and this honest. The alarm was fear, responding to a mistake. This," she gestured toward the tray still balanced in my hands, "this is something else. This is what trust actually looks like before it has a name." Kaylor was silent for a long time, long enough that I felt my arms start to ache from holding the tray steady, long enough that Grace shifted closer, ready to guide me back to safety if the moment turned. But it did not turn. Slowly, deliberately, Kaylor reached out and took the slice of pizza from the tray. He studied it first, turning it slightly in his long fingers, examining the layers the way a scientist might examine a sample. Then, with the entire cafeteria holding its breath, he took a bite. I watched his face the way I had watched Zylara's face 3 days earlier, waiting for some sign, some reaction, anything that would tell me whether this strange, small gesture had worked, or had just made everything worse. His skin shifted first, the storm gray lightening slowly toward its natural violet tone. Then his eyes widened, just slightly, the ridges above them lifting in a motion I now recognized instantly. His mouth opened wider than I expected, an expression that looked almost like surprise crossing into something warmer. "By the old stars," he said quietly, echoing words I had heard from Zylara that first day. "What is this taste?" "Pepperoni and cheese," I said, my voice cracking slightly with relief. "Simple stuff, nothing complicated." Kaylor took a second bite, slower this time, as if trying to hold on to the sensation a little longer. Around the room, I saw other Itheran delegates leaning forward slightly, watching their leader's reaction with open curiosity, some of them exchanging quiet words in their own language. "This is not a weapon," Kaylor said finally, looking at me with an expression that had softened considerably from the anger of just a few minutes earlier. "This is not a demonstration of power. It is exactly what she said, something simple, given without calculation." He turned to Ethan. "Your sensor failure remains a concern," he said. "I expect a full explanation and a plan to prevent it from happening again, but I no longer believe it was intentional, and I no longer believe this station or this species intends harm toward mine." Ethan nodded quickly. "You'll have a complete report within the hour, along with the engineering team's findings." Kaylor looked at me one more time, the slice still in his hand. "You are not a negotiator," he said. "You said this yourself, and yet you may have prevented something today that 100 trained diplomats could not have fixed with words alone." I did not know what to say to that, so I said the only thing that felt true. "I just didn't want anyone to leave hungry, or afraid, without at least trying something good first." A quiet sound moved through the room, something between a laugh and a release of tension, spreading from the Itheran delegation to the human crew members still seated at their tables. Grace lowered her hand from her earpiece. Ethan's shoulders finally relaxed fully. Even the steel shutters over the windows began sliding back up, slowly revealing the stars again, as if the station itself understood the danger had passed. Zylara appeared beside me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder, an Itheran gesture I had learned meant gratitude too large for words. "You did something today that our history books will remember," she said, "not because it was clever, because it was honest." "I just offered pizza," I said. "Twice now." "Yes," she said, and her face opened into that same wide, unguarded smile I had first seen days earlier, the the one that still looked strange and beautiful and completely human all at once, and twice now, it changed everything. Later that evening, after the engineering team confirmed the alarm had indeed been caused by a faulty sensor and nothing more, after Kaylor and Ethan sat down with their teams to finalize the very agreement that had almost collapsed hours earlier, I found myself back in the cafeteria, tray in hand, looking for a seat. Zylara waved me over to her table before I could even scan the room. "Sit," she said. "Eat with us, all of us this time." I looked around the table and saw 5 Ithran delegates, including Kaylor himself, each with a slice of pizza in front of them, waiting. "I have a request," Kaylor said as I sat down, his tone lighter now than I had heard it all day. "My people wish to bring this food home with us, along with the agreement we intend to sign tomorrow. I am told there are many varieties. 700, was it?" "At least," I said, smiling despite the exhaustion settling into my shoulders. "Probably more by now." Kaylor shook his head slowly, an expression that looked almost like disbelief. "Your species is strange, chaotic, and occasionally reckless. But I no longer believe you are dangerous. I believe you are simply generous in ways that are easy to underestimate until you experience them directly." I lifted my own slice toward the center of the table, a small, unplanned gesture that felt right in the moment. "To trust," I said, unsure if it was the correct thing to say but saying it anyway. "Built one slice at a time." Zylara lifted hers too, her smile widening again, warm and open, and entirely without calculation. "To trust," she repeated, and around the table, 5 more slices rose to meet mine, human and Ithran together, in a cafeteria that had nearly become the site of a broken alliance and instead became something else entirely. A beginning,